Trumas Perg Beis Mishnah Aleph. Ein termin mitar ala tameh. When truma is designated, it must be touching or near the produce for which it's being designated. This is called min hamukaf. In general, the halacha of min hamukaf requires only that the two items be near each other. It's not necessary for them to touch. However, if one item is tameh and one is tahar, the din of min hamukaf is not fulfilled unless they are touching. This would have to be done in such a way that the tahar produce does not become tameh. When the halacha of min hamukaf was not fulfilled, the truma designation, although forbidden, is valid bidi ebed. So the Mishnah presents a halachas that are based on this din. Ein termin mitame ala tahar, mitar ala tameh. We may not separate truma from tahar produce for tameh produce. This is forbidden because the chacham were concerned that one who designates tahar produce as truma for tameh produce will violate the halacha of min hamukaf by keeping them apart, for fear that the tameh produce will make the tahar produce tameh. But if people did separate truma from the tahar produce for tameh produce, the truma is valid. In truth, the Chachamim said, this expression introduces a ruling that's regarded as though it was taught halach al Moshe Sinai. The Rav says interesting. Not that it's means that it's a real halach al Moshe Sinai, but the halacha has the strength that it's clear and unquestionable as Zayvi if it would be a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There, the Mishnah in the beginning of Shabbos says that a Rebbe is allowed to see where the children are up to in reading the Torah, and that's a din d'Rabbanan. It's not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Now, there are going to be those that will argue and say that it really is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that a halacha l'Moshe Sinai does have a din d'Rabbanan. That's a separate shmuz. The Marzchias, amongst others, are marach on this. How to understand what exactly is halacha l'Moshe Sinai and what's not. If part of a round cake of pressed figs became tameh and part of it remained tahar, although the figs and the cake are pressed together, they're considered separate items with respect to the halachas of toma. Thus, if only some of the figs become tameh, they don't necessarily contaminate all the other figs. One may separate truma from the tahar figs that are in this cake for the tameh figs that are in this same cake. There's no concern here that one will be over on the halacha of min hamukaf because the tahar and tameh figs are already touching each other. Similarly, if one has a bundle of vegetables or a pile of produce for which some is tameh and some is tahar, one is allowed to designate round tahar items as truma for the tameh items because they're already touching each other. But if there were two round cakes of pressed figs, or two bundles of vegetables, or two piles of produce, one of them is tameh, one of them is tahar, one may not separate truma from this one for that one. Since these are distinct items, he may indeed keep them apart, for which will be against the halacha of, he will not be being mekayim the halacha of min hamukaf. Rabbi Lezer says, termin min atar ala tameh, one may separate truma from produce that is tahar for produce that is tameh in all cases. According to Rabbi Lezer, the Chachamim did not ask for a separation of this type at a concern that one would keep the items apart. I mean, there's no chash that it's not going to be min hamukaf. Mishnah Beis, in termin min tameh ala tahar. After discussing the designation of tahar produce as truma for tameh produce, the Mishnah deals with the opposite case, designating tameh produce as truma for tahar produce. One may not separate truma from tameh produce for tahar produce because instead of giving the kohen tahar produce, which he's allowed to eat, one is giving him tameh produce, which he may not eat. Truma that is tameh may not be eaten by anyone, even a kohen. It must be burnt. However, a kohen may have hana from it by burning it. For example, he may use it to fuel a fire for cooking. It's also to designate tameh produce as truma for tahar produce because this causes a loss to the kohen who receives the truma, for he cannot eat it. Another reason for this iser is the one stated above in the previous Mishnah, namely that it's forbidden to designate tameh produce as truma for tahar produce, or vice versa, because he might violate the halacha of min hamukaf. However, that reason alone would not make the designation ineffective. V'im taram, if one did separate truma from tameh produce for tahar produce, shegeg trumasi truma, the halacha is that if he did so by mistake, he didn't know that it was tameh, so his truma is valid. But if he sinned knowingly, he did it on purpose, he has not done anything. That is, the truma designation is not effective, and he must separate truma again. The Chachamim disqualified the truma designation to punish the person for his deliberate transgression. He must now separate a second portion of truma. According to the din d'oraisa, the first designation was good, so the first portion must be treated as truma. Thus, the first portion is truma min Torah, and the second portion is truma midrabanan. V'chein ben Levi shoyle meiser tevel. Likewise, if a Levi has meiser that is tevel, meiser rishon from which trumas meiser is yet to be separated and is tamei, and he repeatedly separates trumas meiser from meiser rishon that is tahor. The Levi designated a portion of his meiser rishon as trumas meiser for other meiser rishon that he has, and he did this several times. Shogeg masha also. The halacha is that if he did so by mistake, he didn't know that it was tamei. What he did is done, and that trumas meiser is valid. But meizid le'oso klum. Since the Levi was repeatedly separating trumas meiser from this produce, he should have realized over time that it was tamei. The Mishnah teaches that we nevertheless believe him to say that he always thought it was tohar. But if he did it b'meizid, if he sinned knowingly, and he has not done anything, that is, his trumas meiser designation is not effective, and he must separate trumas meiser again. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, according to the previous Tana, if one designates tamei produce for tahor produce by mistake, so the designation is effective. The Mishnah continues with the machlekes in a particular case. Rabbi Yehuda says if he at first knew that it was tamei, then even if he later forgot that it was tamei, so that when he separated truma from it, he sinned by mistake, he has not done anything. The designation is not effective. Since at one point he knew that the produce was tamei, we say that he knowingly designated the tamei produce as truma for the tahor produce, which is an invalid designation. According to this Tana, Rabbi Yehuda, the person's forgetfulness is treated like negligence. Mishnah Gimel. Hamat bil kelim b'Shabbos. Similar to the previous Mishnah, this Mishnah cites cases in which the Chachamim imposed a knas for an avera that was committed knowingly, but not if it was committed by mistake. These cases, however, are primarily related to Hilchos Shabbos rather than to Truma. So, Mat bil kelim b'Shabbos, if someone immersed tamei utensils in a mikveh on Shabbos in order to make them tamei, which is forbidden on Shabbos, immersing a tamei keli is similar to repairing a broken utensil, for which is usher on Shabbos. It's masakin moneh. The immersion repairs it in the sense that it may now be used for purposes such as holding kachim or truma, for which it was unfit when it was tamei. The halacha is that if he did it by mistake, for example, he didn't know that day was Shabbos, he may use these kelim. But if he sinned knowingly, he may not use them, since he deliberately violated the halachas of Shabbos. The Chachamim penalized him by forbidding him to benefit from his mezid. He may not use the immersed utensils until after Shabbos. If someone took off meiser or cooked food on Shabbos, one may not take off meiser on Shabbos because this too repairs the produce by making it halachically fit to be eaten, which would be a tolda of makabah patish. It's also masakin mana. And cooking on Shabbos is also, it's one of the lam tes malachas. So shegeg yoichel, mezid lo yoichel. The halacha is that if he did it by mistake, he may eat the produce that was gemaisert or the cooked food, but if he did it knowingly, he may not eat it. If someone took off meiser on Shabbos without being aware that he was doing an avera, he's allowed to eat it even on that Shabbos. But if he did it b'mezid, he knew that he wasn't allowed to do it anyways, he may not eat it until after Shabbos. The preceding halachas apply to meiser on Shabbos, which is forbidden only midrabanan. Cooking on Shabbos, however, is also midairaisa, and thus the restrictions are greater. If someone cooked on Shabbos without knowing that he's doing an avera, he may not eat the food on that Shabbos, though he may eat it after Shabbos, and if he sinned knowingly, he may never eat it. It's a big machlekes tanoim in the brayso that the Gemara brings in a few places. A different sheet is exactly what's what, but this is like one sheet in the Gemara, which is perfectly fine for our purposes now, how to teach this Mishnah. Hanoi teah b'Shabbos, if someone planted a tree on Shabbos, which is also one of the lamed tes malachas which are also on Shabbos, so shegeg yikayim mezid yakar. The halacha is that if he did it by mistake, he may keep the tree, but if he sinned knowingly, he must uproot it. Ubashvias bein b'shegeg bein b'mezid yakar. But if someone planted a tree during Shemitah, whether he did it by mistake or knowingly, he must uproot the tree. The Chachamim treated the people that are violate Shemitah more strictly than somebody who's Mechal Shabbos, because people are more likely to transgress the halachas of Shemitah than Hilchos Shabbos. The Chachamim were concerned that if someone sees a tree planted during Shemitah and allows it to remain in place, he might think that planting trees during Shemitah is mutter. To prevent people from making this mistake, the Chachamim require the tree to be uprooted. Mishnah Dalet. Ein tarmin mimin al she'enei mina. We may not separate truma for one type of produce for another type, from oil onto wine. The Torah states, Kol chelev yitzar, kol chelev tirei redogan. All the best of your oil and the best of your wine and grain. The word chelev, best, refers to truma, since truma should be the best portion of one's produce, as the Mishnah teaches below. By mentioning the truma of oil separately from the truma of wine and grain, the pasuk teaches that one may not designate one type of produce as truma for another type of produce. Vim taram ain't truma se truma. If someone did it, the truma is not valid. Kol min chitim echad. All types of wheat are considered one. Some varieties of wheat are red, some are white, but they all belong to the same category with respect to truma. It's interesting because we know there's a Gemara that goes through the 5 Minei Dagon, right? There's Chamisha Minei Dagon, Chitim, Sa'irim, Shibel, Shul, Kusman, and Shifain. Right? And the Gemara says that Kusman is a type of Chitin, and Shibel Shul is a type of Sa'irim. So it really is broken down into two, that there's all types of grain. Well, from the Chamesh Minei Dagon, the Avos, so to speak, are Chitim and Sa'irim. So Kalman Chitim Echad, all types of wheat are considered one. Kalman Te'enim Gregor Vela Echad, all types of fresh figs, dried figs, and pressed figs are considered one. This includes both dark and light figs. V'tarim is alzeh, and one may therefore separate truma from any one type of wheat or fig, or for any other type of wheat or fig. The Torah requires Kol Makav Sheish Koyin Torah Min HaYofa, V'Kol Makav She'ein Koyin Torah Min HaMiskayim. The Torah requires that truma be separated from the best part of the crop, as the pasuk says, Mikol Chelbay. The Machlekes Tanoim about the application of this rule. Wherever a kohen is available, to whom the truma can be given right away, one should separate truma from the best produce that he has. For example, if one has fresh figs and dried figs, he should designate only fresh figs as truma for both the fresh and the dried figs, since fresh figs are better than dried ones. But wherever a kohen is not available, and thus one will have to keep the truma for a while before giving it away, one should separate truma from the produce that lasts longer, even if it's not the best produce. For example, if one had fresh figs and dried figs, he should designate only dried figs as truma, because dried figs last longer than fresh ones. The Tanna Kama maintains that in this case, the longer-lasting produce is the best produce, even if it's of lower quality. Truma that will have spoiled by the time the kohen receives it can hardly be described as the best. Rabbi Yehuda but Rabbi Yehuda says that one should always separate truma from the best produce he has, even if no kohen is available, and the other produce will last longer. Rabbi Yehuda derives from a pasuk in the Torah that the higher quality produce is always considered the best, even if it does not last as long as the lower quality produce. Mishnah Hay. Tarmin batal katan shalim lechatzi batal gadol. If truma must be separated for a group of onions in a place where no kohen is available, one should designate a whole small onion as truma rather than half of a big onion. Although big onions taste better than small ones, since a whole onion will last longer than half an onion, a whole onion should be used as truma if no kohen is available. Rabbi Yehuda says this is not so, rather one should designate half of a big onion as truma, since big onions are tastier. Rabbi Yehuda would similarly say, one may designate onions of city dwellers as truma for onions of villagers, but one may not designate onions of villagers as truma for onions of city dwellers, because onions of city dwellers are the food of nobility, which shows that they taste better. Although the onions of villagers last longer, Rabbi Yehuda rules that the onions of city dwellers are considered superior type because they are tastier. What's interesting is that some poskim want to bring a raya from here, that when you have lechem mishnah on Shabbos, is it better to use, if you don't have a whole one, is it better to use from a bigger challah, a half of a bigger challah, rather than a whole small one? Because from this mishnah, it sort of sounds like that. Legabe ela chatzi batal gadol, because the bigger one, which is tastier, or something that's more chashuv in a sense, may be better to use. It's, we would look at it a little more interesting, because we would rather, when you're looking for something that's shalem, when you have a din of shalem, by truma you don't necessarily have a din of shalem, mashenkin by lechem mishnah. It's a shmuz. Mr. Sham will get to when we learn the sugi v'dir and brachas. Mishnah vav. V'tarmin zay shem and al zay kevesh. One may separate oil olives that have a high oil content and are used to produce oil. Although the olives are of the type that produce oil, the owner intends to eat them. This must be the Mishnah's case, for if the owner intends to press them for their oil, they'd be considered unprocessed. One may not designate truma from or for unprocessed produce, as we learned in Parak Aleph, as truma for pickling olives. Zayse kevesh are pickling olives that contain little oil, which are pickled to preserve them for later consumption, because oil olives taste better than pickling olives. But one may not separate pickling olives as truma for oil olives. One may designate uncooked wine as truma for cooked wine, because uncooked wine tastes better than cooked wine. But one may not designate cooked wine as truma for uncooked wine. This is the halacha. We have learned that truma cannot be separated from one type of produce for another type of produce. This Mishnah cites a rule for determining when two items are considered one type and when they are not. The halacha is based on the Isra of Klayim, which says that two different types of plants may not be planted together, which we mentioned throughout Masechta Klayim. So Zahaklav, this is the rule. Kol shu klein b'chaverei, any two items of produce that are klein with each other, that is, the two items may not be planted together because of the Isser of Klayim, liyitrei mizeh al zeh. One may not separate Truma from one for the other. Since they're classified as different types of produce with regard to Klayim, there are different types with regard to Truma as well. For example, under Hilchas Klayim, it's prohibited to plant wheat and barley together. Therefore, one may not designate wheat as Truma for barley or vice versa. Afilu min hayafa ala ra. This is prohibited even if one takes Truma from the better type of produce for the worse one. And any two species of produce which are not klein with each other, that is, they may be planted together because they are the same type. One may separate Truma from the better one for the worse one, but not from the worse one for the better one. Even when both items are of the same type, one may not designate the inferior one as Truma for the superior one. Truma. However, if one did separate Truma from the worse one for the better one, his Truma is valid, except in the case of darnel, an inferior type of wheat used as birdseed that was separated as Truma for wheat, which is invalid Truma because darnel is not a human food, and only human food can be designated as Truma. The regular cucumber and the Kirby cucumber are one type of produce with regard to Truma. Rabbi Yehuda says there are two different types. Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda also disagree in Klayim as to whether regular cucumbers and Kirby cucumbers may be planted together. Ad Kan.